Okay, now let's talk about the Amazon FSx. So FSx is a service, a managed service on AWS, which allows you to launch third-party high-performance file systems on AWS. It's fully managed, and the idea is that maybe sometime you don't want to use Amazon S3, you don't want to use EFS, you want to use something else, and you want to use it, for example, Lustre, that's the Linux cluster, on or Windows file server or NetApp or NTAP. All these things are third-party file system, and that you can launch directly on AWS because they are managed by FSx. So from an exam perspective, you should think of FSx as a way to launch third-party high-performance file systems, and the exam will test on FSx for Lustre, FSx for Windows file server, and for NetApp or NTAP. And it does not cover the NetApp or ONTAP. It does not cover the exam, and it's likely is in like it would be included in the future. The FSx will add more file systems to the FSx service. And now, just as so you know, I will cover them in this slide or in the other slides if they appear at the exam. So until then, this lecture and the next lecture will only cover the FSx for Lustre and FSx for Windows file server. So now let's talk about the Amazon FSx for Windows and the problem statements. So let's explore first Amazon FSx for Windows and this Windows file server. So you remember EFS was to give a shared POSIX system for Linux machine, and FSx for Windows is similar, is going to give you a fully managed Windows file system shared drive accessible for your Windows computers and also Linux computer. So it supports the SMB protocol as well as Windows NTFS. And it has Microsoft Active Directory integration, ACLs, and user quotas. So the idea is that it gives you a file system that is shared for all your Windows machines easily, but you can also mount it on Linux EC2 instances. So it works for both Linux and Windows instances, but remember, this is a Windows file system. Now it has a massive scale. It can scale up to tens of gigabytes per second, millions of IOPS, and hundreds of petabytes of data. Storage option for your FSx for Windows are either to use an SSD, and this is when you want to have like latency sensitive workloads, think databases like media processing, data analytics, or HDD like hard drive for another kind of workload such as home directory or a content management system and so on, but the latency is less important here. SSD is of course going to be more expensive than HDD. Now FSx for Windows can be also accessed from your on-premise infrastructure using a VPN or direct connect service, and you can configure it to be like multi-AZ and provide you high availability. You can also back up your data daily to Amazon S3. So these are the features of the Amazon FSx for Windows. Now let's talk about the second kind of Amazon FSx, which is Amazon FSx for Lustre, and Lustre is used to do a distributed file system that is going to be used for large scale computing. So once I explain you the word Lustre is going to make sense. So Lustre is derived from the Linux and the cluster. So it is used for machine learning and high performance computing, or HPC, and this is a keyword you need to look for to know that you need FSx for Lustre. So you can have applications such as video processing, financial modeling, electronic design automation, and you have massive scale. So you can scale up to hundreds of gigabytes of data per second, millions of IOPS, and some millisecond latency. And for storage, two options like and as for storage, we have two options. Either you want an SSD for low latency, IOPS intensive workload, as well as a small and random file operations, or HDD if you want, then throughput intensive workloads, as well as some small random file operations, or HDD if you want throughput intensive workloads for large and sequential file operation. And SSD is going to be more expensive than HDD. You have seamless integration with Amazon S3. That means that you can read S3 as a file system through FSx, and you can write the output of the computations from FSX back to Amazon S3. And that is something that exam may ask you about. Finally, Amazon FSX for Lusser can be used from on-premise servers through VPN or even the direct connect. Now for FSX, you also need to know the file system deployment options, and there's two. You need to know there is a scratch file system and persistent file system. So a scratch file system is going to be temporary storage, and the data will not be replicated. That means that you have a file and you will lose it if the underlying server fails. Okay, but thanks to this optimization we get really high burst. So we get 6 times the performance of a persistent file system, and you get, for example, 200 megabytes per second per terabyte of throughput. So it's actually really big. So the use case of a scratch file system is going to do the short-term processing of data, and you want to optimize your cost by not having data being replicated. So that means that you have FSX for your compute instances and are going to be connected to availability zone 1, availability zone 2. Then for the FSX for Lusser, scratch file system only has one copy of your data, and as is shown on this diagram, the right here just one copy. Right here, there's just the one copy. Finally, you can also have optional S3 bucket underlaying for the option of underlaying for the long-term like for the data repository. Finally, you can also have S3 bucket underlaying for the data repository. For persistent file system, it's going to be for long-term storage. The data is going to be replicated within the same availability zone. So not across availability zone, but within the same availability zone. But that means that if you have a failure of underlying server, then the files will be replaced transparently within minutes. So the use case of a persistent file system is, as the name indicates, long-term processing and storage of sensitive data. So the idea is that idea is the same in terms of the architecture. Remember, FSX only lives for Lusser only within one single AZ. And the FSX for Lusser file system in persistent mode will have 2 copies of the data. So you can see in the diagram, there is some replication right now from one data volume to the next data volume. So that's it for the this section, this lecture, and exam will ask you scenario based questions on how to choose within scratch persistence. So you should know enough now on the FSX. I hope you like this lecture, and I will see you in the next one.